The tears streaming down Zoe O'Hara's face glistened in the flickering lamplight, as her husband Samuel's cruel laughter filled their small homestead cabin, the sound more painful to her than the bruise forming on her cheek. It was 1878 in the unforgiving territory of Arizona, and Zoe had learned that survival often meant endurance. At 24, she'd already spent 5 years married to a man who had shown his true nature only after their wedding day. Samuel O'Hara had courted her with sweet promises and gentle words, convincing her father that he would provide a good life for his only daughter. None could have predicted how quickly the charming facade would crumble once the marriage certificate was signed. "You think those tears will change anything?" Samuel sneered, his breath heavy with whiskey as he loomed over her. "Crying won't put food on the table or money in my pocket." Zoe's offense had been simple. She'd asked if they might set aside money to replace her worn boots before winter came. The request had triggered Samuel's rage, as did so many things these days. "I work my fingers raw at the mercantile," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I contribute to this household too." Samuel's eyes narrowed dangerously. "And whose decision was it for you to take that job?" "Not mine. I told you a wife's place is at home." "We needed the money after you lost your position at the mine," Zoe replied, instantly regretting her words as his face darkened. "Watch your tongue, woman," he growled, his hand raising again. Zoe flinched, prepared for another blow, but the sharp rap of knuckles on their front door interrupted the moment. Samuel cursed, running a hand through his disheveled hair before pointing a warning finger at her face. "Clean yourself up. I won't have the neighbors talking." Zoe quickly wiped her tears and smoothed her simple cotton dress as Samuel opened the door to reveal Sheriff Clayton, his weathered face grim in the evening light. "Evening, O'Hara," the sheriff said, his eyes briefly flicking to Zoe's reddened face before returning to Samuel. "Need a word with you about that disturbance at Calloway's saloon last night." As the men stepped outside to talk, Zoe moved swiftly to the small mirror hanging by the wash basin. The mark on her cheek was already darkening, and she knew no amount of powder would hide it completely. She had become skilled at explaining away her injuries: a clumsy fall, a kitchen accident, a startled horse. The townspeople of Copper Creek weren't fooled, but few were willing to interfere in a husband's discipline of his wife. Outside, she could hear Samuel's voice rising defensively. The sheriff had been asking more questions lately, especially after Dr. Wilson had treated her broken wrist 3 months ago. But nothing ever came of these inquiries. In the wild territories, the law had limited reach inside a man's home. Samuel stormed back inside 10 minutes later, grabbing his hat from the peg by the door. "I'm going out," he announced, not bothering to look at her. "Don't wait up." The door slammed behind him, and the silence that followed was a temporary mercy. Zoe sank into a chair at their small table, allowing herself to truly cry now that she was alone. 5 years ago, she had been Zoe Olson, the optimistic daughter of a Minnesota farmer who had traveled west with dreams of a fresh start after her mother's death. Now she felt trapped in a nightmare with no awakening in sight. A sound at the window made her jump. Turning, she saw nothing but the darkness beyond the glass. Then came a gentle tap, more deliberate than a branch in the wind. Rising cautiously, Zoe approached the window, her heart racing. When she pulled back the thin curtain, she gasped at the sight of a man's face. Instinctively, she stepped back, but something in his expression, concern rather than threat, made her pause. She recognized him as one of the ranch hands from the Silverton spread outside of town. She'd seen him occasionally at church or in the mercantile where she worked. He motioned for her to open the window, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. "Mrs. O'Hara," he said, his voice low. I don't mean to frighten you. Name's Seth Fletcher. I was passing by and—" His eyes fixed on her cheek and his jaw tightened visibly. "Are you all right, madam?" "Mr. Fletcher, you shouldn't be here," Zoe whispered urgently. "If my husband returns—" "I saw him heading toward the saloon," Seth replied, riding like the devil himself was on his heels. He hesitated, then said with quiet intensity, "I've seen you in town. The marks. The way you flinch when someone moves too quick. This isn't the first time." Zoe felt exposed, vulnerable. No one had ever addressed her situation so directly before. "It's not proper for us to be speaking like this," she said, though she made no move to close the window. Seth's blue eyes held her steadily. "Maybe not, but what's happening to you isn't proper either." He removed his hat, revealing thick, sandy hair. "Mrs. O'Hara, there are people who could help you. The pastor's wife has helped women before. Or I could—" "There's nothing to be done," Zoe interrupted, years of resignation weighing down her words. "He's my husband. The law doesn't give a man the right to beat his wife," Seth said firmly. "No matter what some might claim." He glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. "I work at the Silverton Ranch. If you ever need help, you come there and ask for me, day or night." Before Zoe could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Seth quickly stepped back from the window. "Promise me you'll remember what I said," he urged quietly. "I will," Zoe found herself saying, though she had no intention of taking him up on the offer. What option did she truly have? Running from a marriage was scandalous enough, but where would she go? How would she survive? Seth disappeared into the shadows just as Samuel's voice, louder and more slurred than before, carried from the road. He'd apparently met friends at the saloon and brought them back to continue drinking. Zoe quickly closed the window and returned to the task Samuel expected completed before he returned home, no matter the hour. The house was to be spotless, a meal ready to be warmed, and his clothes prepared for the next day. As she moved through these familiar routines, her mind kept returning to Seth Fletcher's words and the intense conviction with which he'd spoken them. For the first time in years, a dangerous emotion flickered in her heart: hope. The next morning, Zoe awoke before dawn as usual. Samuel slept heavily beside her, his snores rattling the bed frame. She slipped quietly from beneath the covers, wincing at the soreness in her ribs from where he'd shoved her against the table after returning home with his drinking companions. She dressed quickly in the dim light and prepared a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. By the time Samuel stumbled from the bedroom, his face haggard from drink, she had his food waiting on the table. "I'm headed to the mercantile early," she said carefully, keeping her eyes lowered. "Mr. Patterson wants to receive a shipment before opening." Samuel grunted, shoveling food into his mouth. "Be back at the regular time. None of that staying late nonsense." "Yes, Samuel." Zoe gathered her shawl and small lunch pail, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of their home. Outside, the morning air was crisp with autumn's approach. Copper Creek was beginning to stir, the blacksmith's forge already glowing, ranch hands riding through on early errands, a wagon loaded with supplies making its way toward one of the outlying homesteads. The walk to Patterson's mercantile took Zoe past the livery stable, where she nearly collided with Seth Fletcher leading a chestnut mare from the paddock. "Mrs. O'Hara," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, though his eyes immediately found the fresh bruise on her cheekbone that she'd attempted to conceal with her hair. "Mr. Fletcher," she acknowledged quietly, glancing around nervously. Though few people were nearby, in a town the size of Copper Creek, conversations were observed and reported with alarming efficiency. "I meant what I said last night," Seth said softly, adjusting the mare's bridle as if their conversation was merely about the horse. "It's kind of you, but impossible," Zoe replied, her voice barely audible. "Excuse me, I mustn't be late." Seth nodded, but as she moved past him, he said, "Nothing's impossible, Mrs. O'Hara. Some things just require more courage than others." His words followed her all the way to the mercantile, where Mr. Patterson was already unlocking the front door. The older man's face softened with concern when he saw her. "Another accident, Mrs. O'Hara?" he asked gently. Zoe's hand unconsciously rose to her cheek. "Just clumsy, I'm afraid," she murmured, the lie bitter on her tongue. Patterson's eyes held a knowing sadness, but he simply sighed and handed her the inventory list for the morning shipment. "Take care with those crates, then. Wouldn't want any more accidents." The day passed in a blur of customers, stock arrangements, and ledger entries. Zoe found comfort in the routine of the mercantile, grateful for the 6 hours each day when she could exist beyond Samuel's reach. Mr. Patterson was a fair employer who paid her directly, though she was required to hand over most of her earnings to Samuel. She had managed, however, to secretly save a few dollars each month, tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible that had belonged to her mother. The small amount represented her only act of defiance, a tiny seed of potential freedom that she nurtured in secret. As closing time approached, the bell above the door jingled, and Zoe looked up to see Emily Silverton, the wife of the ranch owner where Seth worked. The elegant woman, perhaps 10 years Zoe's senior, approached the counter with a warm smile. "Mrs. O'Hara, I'm so glad you're still here," Emily said. "I need to place a large order for the ranch, and I was hoping you might help me with the details." "Of course, Mrs. Silverton," Zoe replied, reaching for the order ledger. As they worked through the extensive list of supplies, Emily casually mentioned, "Our foreman speaks quite highly of you, says you have quite a head for numbers." Zoe's hand stilled momentarily over the ledger. "Your foreman?" "Seth Fletcher," Emily clarified. "He mentioned you helped him calculate lumber requirements for a project last month when he was in the store." Zoe remembered the interaction, a simple matter of multiplication that Samuel would have mocked her for assisting with. She hadn't realized Seth had noticed her mathematical abilities. "It was nothing special," she said modestly. Emily's eyes were kind but perceptive. "Mr. Fletcher also mentioned that you might be interested in taking on some bookkeeping work. We need someone to organize our ranch accounts, and it could be done primarily on Sundays after church." Zoe's heart raced at the opportunity, both for the additional income and for legitimate time away from Samuel. But reality quickly dampened her excitement. "That's very kind, but my husband wouldn't approve of me taking additional work," she said quietly. Emily leaned slightly closer. "The position pays well, Mrs. O'Hara. Perhaps if he understood the compensation." Zoe hesitated. Samuel's pride was wounded enough by her working at the mercantile, but he couldn't deny their need for money, especially with winter approaching. And if the work was presented as respectable bookkeeping for the prominent Silverton family. "I can speak with him," she finally said, knowing the conversation would require careful navigation. Emily smiled, satisfied. "Excellent. Why don't you join us for Sunday dinner after church this week? You can see the books and we can discuss the particulars. Your husband is welcome, of course." The invitation was delivered innocently enough, but something in Emily's eyes suggested a deeper understanding of Zoe's situation. Before she could respond, the store door opened again, and Zoe's blood ran cold as Samuel stepped inside. His eyes narrowed immediately upon seeing her in conversation with Emily Silverton. He approached with an artificial smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Silverton," he greeted, positioning himself slightly in front of Zoe. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Emily's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. O'Hara, I was just discussing a potential opportunity with your wife. The Silverton Ranch is in need of someone with bookkeeping skills, and I've heard Mrs. O'Hara has quite a talent with figures. Samuel's jaw tightened. My wife's talents are best applied to our home, he said stiffly, and her current position already takes enough of her time. The compensation would be significant, Emily continued smoothly. $15 per week, for what would amount to only a few hours of work, primarily after Sunday services. Zoe could see the calculations happening behind Samuel's eyes. $15 was nearly triple what she earned at the mercantile for a full week's work. We would be honored if you both would join us for Sunday dinner to discuss the arrangement further, Emily added, shrewdly including Samuel in the invitation. After a tense moment, Samuel nodded curtly. We'll consider it, Emily smiled. Wonderful. We'll expect you after church then. She gathered her gloves and turned to leave, but not before giving Zoe a reassuring look. Good day to you both. The moment the door closed behind Emily, Samuel's false pleasantness evaporated. He grabbed Zoe's wrist, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. What game are you playing? He hissed. Arranging work behind my back. I didn't arrange anything, Zoe protested, trying to keep her voice down as Mr. Patterson emerged from the storeroom. Mrs. Silverton suggested it just now. I told her I would need to speak with you. Samuel's grip tightened and Zoe bit her lip to keep from crying out. You're coming home now, he said, his voice deceptively calm for Mr. Patterson's benefit. Your day is done. Mr. Patterson frowned, glancing at the clock. She still has half an hour on her shift, O'Hara. Family matter, Samuel replied shortly. She needs to come with me now. Zoe quickly gathered her things, avoiding Mr. Patterson's concerned gaze. As Samuel practically dragged her from the store, she glimpsed Seth Fletcher across the street, his body tensing as he watched them. Their eyes met briefly before Samuel pulled her around the corner toward their home. The moment they were inside, Samuel's temper erupted. You think you're smart, don't you? Getting the Silvertons involved in our business. I didn't. Zoe's protest was cut short by the back of Samuel's hand striking her face with enough force to send her staggering against the wall. Don't lie to me, he shouted. You've been planning this, looking for ways to undermine me. Samuel, please, Zoe pleaded, tasting blood where her lip had split. Think of the money. $15 a week would help us through the winter. We could even save some. Her attempt at reasoning only seemed to enrage him further. He grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her violently. You think I can't provide for us? Is that it? You think you need to save your precious Silverton money because your husband isn't good enough? No, that's not what his open hand struck her again, and this time Zoe couldn't contain her cry of pain. Tears sprang to her eyes, streaming down her face as she tried to shield herself from further blows. Samuel's laughter cut through her fear, a cruel, mocking sound that somehow hurt more than his physical attacks. Look at you, crying like a child, he sneered. Tears won't change anything, Zoe. They never have. He continued to laugh as she cried, the sound echoing in their small cabin like a twisted melody. Zoe slid down the wall to the floor, curling in on herself, waiting for his rage to burn out as it eventually always did. But this time, the front door suddenly burst open. Samuel whirled around, his laughter dying in his throat as Seth Fletcher stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, eyes blazing with barely contained fury. Her tears end now, O'Hara, Seth said, his voice dangerously quiet as he stepped into the cabin. This stops tonight. Samuel's face contorted with rage. You dare break into my home? This is between me and my wife, Fletcher. Get out before I put a bullet in you. Seth's gaze moved briefly to Zoe, huddled against the wall before returning to Samuel. Mrs. O'Hara needs medical attention, he said evenly. and you need to step away from her. Now." Samuel lunged for the rifle mounted above the fireplace, but Seth was faster. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and tackled Samuel to the ground. The men crashed into the table, sending dishes shattering across the floor as they grappled. Despite his drunken state, Samuel fought viciously, landing a solid punch to Seth's jaw. But Seth had the advantage of sobriety and righteous anger. He pinned Samuel with a knee to his chest, one hand gripping the man's collar while the other remained cocked in a fist. "Give me a raisin," Seth growled. "Just one." Zoe scrambled to her feet. "Please," she begged, unsure if she was addressing Seth or Samuel. "No more violence." Samuel used the momentary distraction to reach for a broken piece of pottery, swinging it toward Seth's face. Seth jerked back, but the jagged edge still caught his cheek, drawing a line of blood. In the next instant, Seth's fist connected with Samuel's jaw, rendering him unconscious with a single powerful blow. The sudden silence in the cabin was broken only by Seth's and Zoe's heavy breathing. Seth rose slowly, checking to ensure Samuel was truly unconscious before turning to Zoe. "Are you hurt badly?" he asked, his voice gentle now, a stark contrast to the fury he directed at Samuel. Zoe's hand trembled as she touched her swollen cheek and split lip. "I'll heal," she said, the response automatic after years of injury. Seth's expression darkened, but he kept his distance, seeming to understand her fear. "Mrs. O'Hara, Zoe, you can't stay here when he wakes up." "Where would I go?" Zoe asked, the reality of her situation crashing down around her. "He's my husband. The law can't force you to stay with a man who beats you," Seth interrupted. "Sheriff Clayton has been looking for a reason to lock O'Hara up for months. This," he gestured to her injuries, "is more than enough." Samuel groaned from the floor, beginning to stir. "We don't have much time," Seth said urgently. "Please, Mrs. O'Hara, let me take you to the Silverton Ranch. Mrs. Silverton will help you. You'll be safe there while this is sorted out." Zoe hesitated, years of conditioning making the decision seem impossible. To leave her husband, no matter how cruel, was to invite scandal and uncertainty. But to stay— Her eyes fell on a framed daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, her mother's gentle smile, her father's proud stance. They had loved each other deeply. Her mother had never flinched at her father's approach, never hidden bruises beneath high collars and long sleeves. "I need to take some things," she said suddenly, decision crystallizing. "Just a few belongings." Seth nodded, relief visible in his expression. "Be quick." "I'll make sure he doesn't wake fully." Zoe rushed to the bedroom, hands shaking as she pulled her mother's quilt from the bed and stuffed it into a cloth sack along with a change of clothes, her mother's Bible with the hidden money, and a small silver hairbrush that had been a wedding gift from her father. There was little else she cared to take from a home that had become a prison. When she returned to the main room, Seth had bound Samuel's hands with a length of rope and propped him in a chair. Samuel's eyes were open now, glaring with hatred at both of them. "You whore," he spat at Zoe, straining against his bindings. "Running off with another man. The whole town will know what you are." Seth took a step toward him, but Zoe placed a restraining hand on his arm. "He's not worth it," she said quietly. "And we need to leave before someone hears the commotion." Seth nodded, though his jaw remained tight with anger. "We'll send the sheriff back to deal with him," he said. "My horse is tethered outside." "You think this ends here?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "She's my wife. The law is on my side. She has nowhere to go, nothing to her name that isn't mine by right." Seth turned to face him fully. "You're wrong, O'Hara. She has more than you could ever understand: courage, dignity, and people who will stand beside her." He looked at Zoe. "Are you ready?" Zoe took one last look around the cabin that had been her home and prison for 5 years. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm ready." Outside, the evening had deepened into true darkness. Seth helped Zoe onto his horse before mounting behind her, his arms forming a protective circle as he took the reins. The warmth of him at her back was startling after years of flinching from male contact. "We'll ride for the ranch," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "It's about 5 miles. Can you manage?" Zoe nodded, suddenly too exhausted for words. As they set off at a steady trot, she allowed herself to lean slightly back against Seth's solid chest. The rhythmic movement of the horse and the night air on her face bringing an unexpected sense of peace, despite the uncertainty ahead. Behind them, Samuel's shouts faded into the distance, carried away by the wind like autumn leaves, insubstantial and ultimately powerless to follow where she was going. The Silverton Ranch sprawled across 1,000 acres of prime Arizona territory, its main house rising from the landscape like a beacon of civilization in the rugged wilderness. As Seth guided his horse up the long drive, lights glowed warmly from the windows, and Zoe was struck by how different this homecoming was from her returns to the small cabin she had shared with Samuel. Emily Silverton herself appeared on the wide veranda as they approached, a lantern held aloft. At the sight of them, she quickly passed the light to a waiting servant and hurried down the steps. "Mrs. O'Hara," she called, her face etched with concern as Seth helped Zoe dismount. In the lamplight, Zoe knew her injuries must be starkly visible. "My God, what happened?" "O'Hara," Seth explained grimly, keeping a supportive hand under Zoe's elbow. "I found him beating her. I couldn't stand by any longer." Emily's expression hardened momentarily before she turned to Zoe with gentle determination. "Come inside, my dear. We need to tend to those wounds and get you settled." Too overwhelmed to protest, Zoe allowed herself to be led into the spacious home, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance in such elegant surroundings. The entrance hall alone was larger than her entire cabin, with polished wood floors and a grand staircase curving upward. "James," Emily called, and a distinguished man Zoe recognized as Robert Silverton emerged from a side room. His eyes widened at the sight of her battered face. "What in heaven's name?" he began. "Samuel O'Hara," Emily said tersely. Seth intervened. Understanding immediately crossed Robert's face. "I'll send for Dr. Wilson," he said, already moving toward the door, "and I'll personally inform Sheriff Clayton." "He's tied up at their cabin," Seth supplied, "but he might not stay that way for long." Robert nodded grimly. "I'll handle it. Emily will see to Mrs. O'Hara." As the men departed on their separate missions, Emily guided Zoe to a comfortable sitting room and gently helped her onto a velvet settee. A maid appeared with a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a small bottle that Emily explained contained witch hazel. "This will help with the swelling," she said, dampening a cloth and carefully dabbing at Zoe's split lip. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. O'Hara. I suspected things were difficult, but I had no idea." "Please," Zoe interrupted softly, "call me Zoe." Emily smiled. "Zoe then, and you must call me Emily. I think we can dispense with formalities under the circumstances." As Emily tended to her wounds, Zoe felt the tight control she had maintained for so long beginning to unravel. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I've left my husband. I have nowhere to go, no family, very little money of my own." "You have a place here for as long as you need it," Emily said firmly, "and more friends than you realize. Half the town has been concerned about your situation for years." "Then why did no one help before?" Zoe asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Emily sighed, setting aside the cloth. "Fear, propriety, uncertainty about interfering between husband and wife. none of which excuses our collective failure to act. She took Zoe's hands in hers. But that changes now. You're not alone in this fight, Zoe. Later, after Dr. Wilson had examined her and confirmed that her injuries, while painful, would heal without permanent damage. Zoe was shown to a comfortable bedroom on the second floor. The four-poster bed with its soft quilts and plump pillows looked like something from a dream compared to the thin mattress she had shared with Samuel. "Try to rest," Emily urged, placing a nightgown on the bed. "We'll talk more in the morning when things seem clearer." Left alone, Zoe moved to the window, gazing out at the vast expanse of land bathed in moonlight. Freedom and terror warred within her the exhilaration of escape, mingled with the dread of what would come next. Samuel would not let her go easily, and divorce was scandalous, expensive, and difficult to obtain, especially for a woman. A soft knock at the door pulled her from these thoughts. Opening it cautiously, she found Seth standing in the hallway, his cheek now bandaged where Samuel's makeshift weapon had cut him. "Forgive the intrusion," he said quietly. "I wanted to check that you were settling in before I returned to the bunkhouse." "You've done so much already," Zoe replied. "I don't know how to thank you." Seth shook his head. "There's no thanks needed for doing what any decent man should have done long ago." He hesitated, then added, "Sheriff Clayton has O'Hara in custody. He's being charged with assault." Relief flooded through Zoe, though she knew it was likely temporary. "What happens when he's released?" "That's a concern for another day," Seth said gently. "For now, you're safe, and that's what matters most." In the soft lamplight of the hallway, Zoe truly looked at Seth Fletcher for the first time. He was perhaps 30, with features that spoke of both strength and kindness, a strong jaw softened by expressive blue eyes, work-roughened hands that had nevertheless touched her with careful respect. He was handsome in an understated way that had nothing of Samuel's flashy charm but suggested something far more substantial. "Why did you help me?" she asked suddenly. "You hardly know me." Seth's expression grew thoughtful. "I've seen you in town for years, Mrs. O'Hara. Watched you work hard at the mercantile, observed your kindness to others despite your own troubles." He paused. "And perhaps I recognized something in you that reminded me of my own mother, who endured a similar situation until it was too late for anyone to help her." The quiet confession opened a window into his motivation that Zoe hadn't expected. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said softly. "It was many years ago," Seth replied, "but it taught me that standing by while someone suffers is its own kind of wrong." He straightened slightly, seeming to realize he had shared more than he intended. "You should rest now. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." As he turned to leave, Zoe found herself calling after him. "Mr. Fletcher," he looked back, a question in his eyes. "Thank you for saying my tears needed to end," she said. "No one has ever stood up for me that way before." A gentle smile touched his lips. "Sleep well, Mrs. O'Hara." Long after he'd gone, Zoe remained by the door, her fingertips absently tracing the wooden frame as she considered the strange turn her life had taken in a single evening. For the first time in 5 years, she would sleep without fear. Whatever the future held, tonight she was safe. And that, she realized as she finally crawled beneath the soft quilts, was a gift beyond measure. News travels quickly in small western towns, and by morning, most of Copper Creek knew that Zoe O'Hara had fled her husband's home with the help of the Silverton Ranch foreman. Opinions were divided. Some whispered about impropriety and scandal, while others nodded in grim satisfaction that Samuel's cruelty had finally been challenged. When Zoe descended to breakfast the next morning, she found Robert and Emily Silverton waiting with Sheriff Clayton, whose weathered face bore an expression of official discomfort. "Mrs. O'Hara," he greeted, standing as she entered. "I hope you're feeling somewhat better this morning." The sheriff's eyes lingered on her bruised face, and Zoe resisted the urge to touch the marks. "I am, thank you," she replied, accepting the cup of coffee Emily poured for her. "I've come to discuss the situation with your husband," Clayton continued. "He's been charged with assault based on your injuries and Mr. Fletcher's witness statement. However," he hesitated, glancing at the Silvertons before continuing, "the judge is only willing to hold him for 3 days without further evidence or formal testimony from you." 3 days. Emily interjected, her voice sharp with indignation. "Look at her face, Sheriff. Isn't that evidence enough?" Clayton sighed. "Ordinarily, assault charges would be taken more seriously, but given that it's a domestic situation, the judge is reluctant to intervene extensively between husband and wife without Mrs. O'Hara's sworn statement." Zoe's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "And if I give this statement, then O'Hara would face proper charges, possibly up to 6 months in jail, depending on the judge's ruling," Clayton explained. "But I must warn you, Mrs. O'Hara, testifying against your husband is an uncommon step that will cause considerable talk." "There's already considerable talk, I imagine," Zoe replied with unexpected steadiness. "What concerns me more is what happens when he's released, whether in 3 days or 6 months. He'll still be my husband. I'll still have no legal right to refuse his authority over me." Robert Silverton cleared his throat. "There are legal options, Mrs. O'Hara, divorce being one of them." "On what grounds?" Zoe asked bitterly. "Cruelty is rarely sufficient for a wife to obtain a divorce, especially when the husband contests it, and Samuel will contest it if only to punish me." "There are other grounds," Robert said carefully. "Abandonment, for instance, if he were to leave the territory." "Samuel won't simply leave," Zoe said. "Not while he believes he can force me to return." "Then perhaps," Emily suggested, "we need to give him a reason to want to leave." Before this cryptic statement could be explored further, the housekeeper appeared to announce that Seth Fletcher was waiting to speak with Mr. Silverton on an urgent matter. "Send him in," Robert directed. Seth entered, hat in hand, nodding respectfully to everyone before addressing his employer. "Mr. Silverton, I've just come from town. There's a situation developing that concerns Mrs. O'Hara." All eyes turned to him as he continued. "O'Hara's brother has arrived from Tucson. He's at the jail now, attempting to arrange Samuel's release. He's claiming that Mrs. O'Hara is unstable and prone to self-harm, that her injuries are self-inflicted." "That's absurd," Emily exclaimed. "Absurd, but potentially effective," Clayton admitted reluctantly. "Judge Parker is already hesitant about intervening in marital disputes. If there's conflicting testimony about the source of Mrs. O'Hara's injuries." "I've never even met Samuel's brother," Zoe said, distress evident in her voice. "He's fabricating this to help Samuel avoid consequences." Seth's expression was grim. "There's more. The brother is apparently wealthy with mining interests in Tucson. He's offering to post a substantial bond for Samuel's release." Sheriff Clayton stood, reaching for his hat. "I should get back to town. I'll do what I can to delay any release, but with money involved." He left the implication hanging. After the sheriff departed, a heavy silence fell over the room. Zoe felt the fragile security she'd begun to feel crumbling around her. "He'll come for me," she said quietly. "As soon as he's released." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Seth responded, his voice hard with determination. "The Silvertons have influence in this territory, and so do others who care about justice." Robert nodded in agreement. "Fletcher's right. We won't abandon you to that man, Mrs. O'Hara, but we do need to consider our next steps carefully." Emily rose gracefully. "First, We ensure Zoe's immediate safety. She'll remain here with additional ranch hands assigned to security. Second, we gather support from the community, people who have witnessed O'Hara's behavior over time and can counter this ridiculous claim about self-harm. Mr. Patterson at the Mercantile, Zoe suggested, and Dr. Wilson. They've both seen evidence over the years. Good, Emily approved. And third, we explore legal options beyond criminal charges. Robert, didn't you mention that your college friend from Boston is now practicing law in Prescott? Perhaps he could advise us on divorce proceedings that might actually succeed. As the Silvertons continued planning, Zoe found her gaze drawn to Seth, who stood slightly apart from the group, his expression thoughtful. When he noticed her watching, he offered a reassuring nod that somehow conveyed more comfort than all the strategic discussions combined. Later that morning, Zoe sat on the ranch house veranda, wrapped in a shawl against the autumn breeze, watching as ranch hands went about their daily tasks in the distance. The purposeful activity was soothing after the intensity of the morning's discussions. "Mind if I join you?" Seth stood at the top of the steps, his tall frame silhouetted against the clear blue sky. At her nod, he settled into the chair beside hers, stretching his long legs before him. "How are you truly feeling?" he asked, his gaze direct but gentle. "Beyond the polite answers you've been giving the Silvertons." The question, so simple yet so penetrating, caught Zoe off guard. "Scared," she admitted after a moment. "Relieved, guilty, confused, all at once." "Guilty?" Seth prompted, his brow furrowing. Zoe sighed, looking out across the ranch land. 5 years of marriage, Mr. Fletcher. 5 years of being told that every problem was my fault, that I provoked his anger, that a better wife wouldn't make him so unhappy. She twisted her hands in her lap. Even knowing those were lies, some part of me absorbed them. "That's how men like O'Hara maintain control," Seth said quietly. "They make you doubt your own worth until you believe you deserve the treatment they inflict." "You understand that very well," Zoe observed, studying his profile. Seth nodded slowly. "My father was cut from similar cloth, not as violent perhaps, but cruel in his own way. My mother withered under his constant criticism, like a plant deprived of sunlight." "You mentioned she died," Zoe said softly, "when I was 16. Officially, it was pneumonia that took her, but I've always believed she simply lost the will to continue." His jaw tightened. "I left home the day after we buried her, never saw my father again." The shared confidence created a bridge between them that transcended their brief acquaintance. In Seth's understanding, Zoe found a validation of her experiences that even the well-meaning Silvertons couldn't provide. "What will you do if Samuel is released?" Seth asked after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. "I don't know," Zoe confessed. "I can't return to him, that much I've decided. But beyond that—" She shook her head. "I have some savings, not much, enough perhaps to reach my cousin in California, though I haven't seen her in years." Seth turned to face her directly. "Or you could stay in Copper Creek and face the gossip." "The judgment," Zoe smiled sadly. "A woman who's left her husband has few respectable options, Mr. Fletcher, especially in a small town where everyone knows her business. People's memories are shorter than you might think, especially when there's fresh scandal to distract them," Seth replied. "And you have friends here who would stand by you." "Friends like you?" Zoe asked, the question slipping out before she could reconsider its implications. Seth's eyes held her steadily. "Yes, Mrs. O'Hara, like me." Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a connection that went beyond the dramatic circumstances of their recent interaction. It frightened and exhilarated Zoe in equal measure, and she quickly looked away, uncertain how to respond. Seth seemed to sense her discomfort. He stood, offering a slight smile. "I should return to my duties, but please remember, whatever you decide, you're not alone in this." As he descended the veranda steps, Zoe called after him. "Mr. Fletcher," he paused, looking back. "Thank you," she said simply. His smile deepened, reaching his eyes this time. "You're welcome, Mrs. O'Hara." Watching him stride away toward the stables, Zoe felt a curious lightness in her chest, not quite hope, perhaps, but the sense that hope might eventually be possible again. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten during her years with Samuel. The following day brought unwelcome news. Despite the efforts of Sheriff Clayton and the Silvertons, Judge Parker had accepted the substantial bond offered by Samuel's brother and ordered Samuel's release, with only a warning to maintain the peace and a requirement to appear for a hearing the following month. "He's demanding to see you," Sheriff Clayton reported grimly when he came to inform Zoe of the development. "Says he wants to reconcile. I told him you're not required to meet with him, but he's threatening to bring formal charges of abandonment if you refuse to return home." "Can he do that?" Emily asked, her arm protectively around Zoe's shoulders. "Legally, he has certain rights as her husband," Clayton admitted reluctantly. "But enforcing those rights is another matter. I won't physically compel Mrs. O'Hara to return to a situation I know to be dangerous." "Thank you, Sheriff," Zoe said quietly. After Clayton departed, Robert Silverton called an impromptu council of those most invested in Zoe's welfare. In addition to the Silvertons and Seth, Mr. Patterson from the Mercantile and Dr. Wilson joined them in the ranch house parlor. "We need to consider all options," Robert began, his tone businesslike. "Mrs. O'Hara's safety is our primary concern. She could leave the territory," Mr. Patterson suggested. "Start fresh somewhere O'Hara couldn't easily follow." Dr. Wilson shook his head. "Running doesn't solve the legal complications. O'Hara could still pursue her for abandonment, potentially freezing any assets or preventing her from legally remarrying in the future." "What about divorce?" Emily asked. "Robert, you mentioned your lawyer friend in Prescott." "I've sent a telegram," Robert confirmed. But as Mrs. O'Hara herself pointed out, proving cruelty to the satisfaction of the court is difficult when the husband contests the divorce. And with his brother's money behind him, O'Hara can afford to drag out legal proceedings indefinitely. As the discussion continued, Zoe felt increasingly like a spectator to her own fate. Everyone spoke about her situation with genuine concern, yet none of the proposed solutions seemed viable without months or years of legal battles she could ill afford. "There is another option," Seth said suddenly, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. All eyes turned to him as he continued, "one that would immediately change Mrs. O'Hara's legal standing." "And what's that?" Dr. Wilson asked skeptically. Seth's gaze met Zoe's directly. "Marriage to another man." A stunned silence fell over the room. Zoe stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "That's impossible," Mr. Patterson sputtered. "She's already married." "Not if the first marriage is annulled," Seth replied calmly. "There are grounds, fraud being the most applicable. O'Hara presented himself as one kind of man during courtship and proved to be entirely different after marriage." Dr. Wilson frowned. "Annulments are even harder to obtain than divorces, Fletcher, especially after 5 years. "Not necessarily," Robert interjected, looking thoughtful. "Not with the right judge and compelling evidence. And an annulment followed immediately by remarriage would create a legal complication that could take years to untangle, years during which Mrs. O'Hara would be under the protection of her new husband rather than subject to O'Hara's authority." "You can't be seriously considering this," Emily said, her expression troubled. "Arranging a marriage merely as a legal strategy." "Who would even," she broke off as understanding dawned, her eyes moving between Seth and Zoe. Oh. Seth stood, his posture straight and dignified despite the scrutiny of everyone in the room. I would be willing to enter such an arrangement with Mrs. O'Hara if she were amenable. A marriage of convenience, providing legal protection while she determines her longer-term wishes. Zoe felt as though the air had been pulled from the room. The proposal was so unexpected, so utterly beyond anything she had considered, that she could form no immediate response. Sensing her shock, Robert gently suggested, "Perhaps we should give Mrs. O'Hara some time to consider this proposition privately." The others murmured agreement, and within moments, Zoe found herself alone with Seth in the suddenly silent parlor. "I apologize if my suggestion seemed presumptuous," he said quietly when the door closed behind the others. "It was not my intention to add to your distress." "It's not presumptuous," Zoe managed, finding her voice at last. "It's extraordinary. You barely know me, Mr. Fletcher. Why would you offer to bind yourself legally to a woman you hardly know?" Seth moved to sit across from her, his expression earnest. "I know enough, Mrs. O'Hara. I know you're courageous, resilient, and deserving of a chance at peace. I know that what your husband did was unconscionable, and that the law offers you little protection as things stand." "And what would you gain from this arrangement?" Zoe asked, unable to fathom his motivation. "The satisfaction of helping someone who deserves better than what life has dealt her," Seth replied simply. "And perhaps the companionship of a woman I've come to admire, even in our brief acquaintance." "Companionship," Zoe repeated, a flush rising to her cheeks as she considered the implications of marriage, even one entered for practical purposes. "Mr. Fletcher, a marriage even in name only would entail certain expectations." Seth's expression remained respectful. "Only those we mutually agree upon, Mrs. O'Hara. I would make no demands of you. The arrangement could be as limited or as genuine as we both wished it to be, developing naturally over time if that was our choice." Zoe rose, moving to the window to gather her thoughts. Outside, the ranch continued its daily rhythms, oblivious to the life-altering conversation taking place within the house. "This is not a decision I can make lightly," she finally said. "Marriage has been a painful experience for me." "I understand," Seth said, standing as well but maintaining a respectful distance. "And I would never press you for an answer you're not ready to give. But time is a luxury we may not have, with O'Hara free and determined to reassert his claim on you." Zoe turned to face him, studying the man who had already risked so much on her behalf. In different circumstances, she might have found Seth Fletcher's quiet strength and integrity appealing for reasons that had nothing to do with legal protection. The thought sent a surprising warmth through her. "I need to think," she said at last, "to be certain this is the right path for both our sakes." Seth nodded, reaching for his hat. "Of course. I'll return tomorrow morning for your answer if that's agreeable." "Yes," Zoe agreed, her mind already racing with the implications of his offer. Tomorrow. After Seth departed, Zoe sought the solitude of the garden behind the ranch house. Emily found her there an hour later, sitting on a stone bench beneath a cottonwood tree. "I wondered where you disappeared to," Emily said, settling beside her. "That was quite a proposal Fletcher made." Zoe smiled faintly. "Not the romantic kind girls dream of." "Perhaps not," Emily conceded, "but there was something rather gallant about it nonetheless." She studied Zoe's profile. "What are you thinking?" "That I'm terrified of making another mistake," Zoe admitted. "I thought I knew Samuel when I married him. I was so certain of his character, and I was completely wrong." "Seth Fletcher is not Samuel O'Hara," Emily said firmly. "No," Zoe agreed. "But marriage, real or arranged, is still a leap of faith, and my faith has been badly shaken." Emily was quiet for a moment, then said, "When I first met Robert, I was engaged to another man, a banker from San Francisco. Everything about the match was suitable. Good family, secure future, my parents' approval, but I felt nothing when he kissed me." She smiled at the memory. "Then Robert came to a dinner party at my parents' home. He was visiting California on ranch business, rough around the edges compared to San Francisco society. But when our eyes met across that dining table, I knew." "Knew what?" Zoe asked. "That I'd rather risk happiness with an uncertain future than accept security without joy." Emily patted Zoe's hand. "I'm not suggesting you're in love with Fletcher, of course, only that sometimes the bravest choice isn't the safest one." As twilight deepened around them, Zoe considered Emily's words and the decision that waited for her. By the time she retired to her room that night, a sense of clarity had begun to emerge from the confusion of the past days. She slept little, her mind revisiting every interaction with Seth Fletcher since that moment at her window when he had declared her tears would end. By dawn, she had made her decision. Seth arrived at the ranch just after breakfast, his usually confident demeanor showing signs of tension as he was shown to the small library where Zoe waited. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, his work clothes replaced by a clean white shirt and dark waistcoat, his hair neatly combed. "Mrs. O'Hara," he greeted, hat in hand. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough to think clearly," she replied, gesturing for him to sit. When he had settled across from her, she continued, "I've considered your proposal carefully, Mr. Fletcher." Seth nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "And your decision? Before I give it, I need to understand exactly what you're offering," Zoe said. "A marriage of convenience for legal protection is one thing. But what are your expectations for how such an arrangement would function? Where would we live? How would we present ourselves to the community? What happens if one of us wishes to end the arrangement?" Seth seemed relieved by her practical questions. "I own a small homestead about 3 miles from town, nothing grand, but comfortable enough. 2 bedrooms," he added meaningfully. "As for our public presentation, I believe we would need to appear as a genuine married couple to avoid suspicion or legal complications. Within the privacy of our home, however, our relationship would be whatever we mutually decided. And if the arrangement no longer suited one of us, then we would seek a proper divorce by mutual agreement, which is far simpler to obtain than a contested one," Seth replied. "I would, of course, ensure you received a fair financial settlement to secure your independence." Zoe studied him, searching for any hint of deception or ulterior motive in his open gaze. Finding none, she asked the question that had troubled her most during her sleepless night. "Why, Mr. Fletcher? Why would you offer marriage to help a woman you barely know? The truth, please." Seth was silent for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "When I was 16, watching my mother's coffin being lowered into the ground, I made a promise. I promised I would never stand by while someone suffered as she had suffered." His eyes, when they met Zoe's, held a quiet intensity. "I've known who you were for 3 years, Mrs. O'Hara. I've seen the gradual dimming of your spirit, the careful way you moved when injuries were fresh, the fear that shadowed your eyes whenever your husband appeared in town." "You noticed all that," Zoe whispered, stunned by his observation. "I noticed," Seth confirmed, "and each time I remembered my promise, but I did nothing, told myself it wasn't my place, that intervention might make things worse for you." His jaw tightened. 2 nights ago, when I heard you crying through that open window, something inside me broke. I couldn't stand by any longer, not even for one more moment." The raw honesty of his confession touched something deep within Zoe. Here was a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable, and responded not with judgment or exploitation, but with a profound sense of justice and compassion. "My offer of marriage isn't entirely selfless," Seth continued after a moment. "I've lived alone since coming to Arizona 7 years ago. I've built a good life, but a solitary one. The prospect of sharing that life with someone like you, someone with your courage and dignity, is not an unappealing one." Zoe rose from her chair, moving to the window as she had the day before. This time, however, her mind was clear, her decision made. "Yes," she said simply, turning back to face him. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Fletcher." Relief and something warmer flickered across Seth's face as he stood. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be about anything right now," Zoe replied honestly. "I believe you're a good man, Seth Fletcher. And I need a good man's name to protect me from the one who wasn't." Seth crossed the room to stand before her, close but not crowding. "Then we should act quickly. O'Hara won't wait long once he learns of our intentions." The events of the next 24 hours unfolded with a swiftness that left Zoe feeling as though she were living someone else's life. Robert Silverton's influence secured an emergency hearing with Judge Wilson from the next county, a man known to be less sympathetic to husbands' absolute rights than Judge Parker. Dr. Wilson provided sworn testimony about Zoe's injuries over the years, while Mr. Patterson attested to Samuel's public displays of temper and controlling behavior. Most critically, Reverend Thomas from the Episcopal Church produced documentation showing that Samuel O'Hara had been previously married in Texas, a fact he had concealed from Zoe during their courtship. Though the first wife had died before Samuel moved to Arizona, his deliberate concealment of the marriage constituted legal fraud, providing grounds for annulment rather than divorce. By sunset the following day, Zoe stood in the Silvertons' parlor wearing a borrowed blue dress, her annulment papers signed, and her hand trembling slightly in Seth's as Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride," the judge concluded, looking expectantly at the new couple. Seth's eyes met Zoe's, silently asking permission. At her slight nod, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers, a brief, chaste touch that nevertheless sent an unexpected warmth through her body. The small gathering of witnesses, the Silvertons, Mr. Patterson, Dr. Wilson, and Sheriff Clayton, offered quiet congratulations, their knowledge of the arrangement's true nature unspoken, but understood. "I've arranged for deputies to watch O'Hara's movements," Sheriff Clayton informed them quietly. "He knows something's happening, but not what. He was drinking heavily at the saloon when I left town." "We'll leave for my homestead within the hour," Seth replied. "Mrs. Fletcher's belongings." Zoe started slightly at the sound of her new name, a name she had acquired mere moments ago, yet which already felt more rightfully hers than O'Hara ever had. "Already loaded in the wagon," Robert confirmed, "along with some additional supplies Emily insisted upon." Within the hour, as promised, Seth helped Zoe into a wagon loaded with her few possessions and the Silvertons' generous gifts. As they prepared to depart, Emily embraced Zoe tightly. "Remember," she whispered, "this may have begun as an arrangement of convenience, but life has a way of surprising us. Be open to those surprises." With final farewells exchanged, Seth clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled down the drive toward the main road. Darkness had fallen fully now, the road illuminated only by their lantern and the brilliant canopy of stars overhead. "It's about an hour's journey," Seth told her, his profile strong against the night sky. "The road's good most of the way." Zoe nodded, suddenly acutely aware of the strangeness of her situation. She was traveling into the night with a man she barely knew, a man who was now, in the eyes of the law, her husband. "You're very quiet," Seth observed after a few minutes of travel. Second thoughts? No, Zoe replied honestly. Just adjusting to how quickly life can change. Yesterday morning I woke up as Mrs. O'Hara, trapped in a marriage I couldn't escape. Tonight I'm Mrs. Fletcher, heading to a home I've never seen with a husband I barely know. Seth's expression was thoughtful in the lantern light. Life rarely follows the paths we expect, for better or worse. More often worse, in my experience, Zoe said, then immediately regretted the bitterness in her tone. I'm sorry. That sounds ungrateful after everything you've done. Don't apologize for honesty, Seth replied. The past 5 years have given you ample reason for caution. I don't expect trust to come easily. His understanding eased something tight in Zoe's chest. Thank you for that. They traveled in comfortable silence for a time, the rhythmic sound of hooves and creaking wagon wheels creating a peaceful backdrop to Zoe's thoughts. Gradually, the tension that had been her constant companion for days began to ebb, replaced by a tentative curiosity about the new life awaiting her. Tell me about your homestead, she requested, genuinely interested in learning about the place that would now be her home. Seth's face brightened visibly at the topic. It's nothing grand, 160 acres under the Homestead Act. The house is small but solid, 2 bedrooms, a good-sized kitchen, and a front room. There's a barn, chicken coop, and a decent garden plot that could use a woman's touch, truth be told. Crops? Zoe asked. Some, Seth nodded. 20 acres under cultivation, mostly corn and beans. The rest is grazing land for my small herd. Working at the Silverton Ranch provides my main income, though. The homestead supplements it. As he continued describing the property, Zoe could hear the pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a man who had built something meaningful with his own hands. It was so different from Samuel's perpetual dissatisfaction, his constant complaints about what he lacked rather than appreciation for what he possessed. It sounds lovely, she said when he finished. A real home. Seth glanced at her, his expression softening. I hope it will be, Mrs. Fletcher. For both of us. An hour later, the wagon turned down a narrow lane bordered by cottonwood trees. As they rounded a bend, Seth's homestead came into view, a low, sturdy house with a wide porch, its windows dark but welcoming against the night sky. A barn stood nearby, along with various smaller outbuildings whose details were obscured by darkness. Home, Seth announced, bringing the wagon to a halt before the house. He jumped down and came around to help Zoe descend, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Once on the ground, Zoe took a moment to breathe in the night air, heavy with the scent of earth and growing things. The silence was profound after the constant activity of the Silverton Ranch, broken only by the occasional call of a night bird and the soft nickering of horses in the nearby paddock. Let me light the lamps inside before we unload, Seth suggested, already moving toward the porch. Everything's been closed up for a few days. Zoe followed him up the steps, waiting as he unlocked the door and disappeared inside. Moments later, warm light spilled from the windows and Seth reappeared in the doorway. Come in, he invited. It's not fancy, but it's home. Crossing the threshold, Zoe found herself in a simple but comfortable front room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by bookshelves filled with well-worn volumes. Sturdy furniture, a sofa, 2 armchairs, and a low table created a cozy gathering space, while a desk in the corner suggested Seth occasionally brought ranch work home with him. The kitchen's through there, Seth indicated an archway to the right. Bedrooms and washroom to the left. I'll show you properly after we've brought in your things. They worked together to unload the wagon, Seth carrying the heavier trunks while Zoe managed the smaller items. By the time they finished, A small collection of her possessions had accumulated in the front room, a strange juxtaposition against Seth's bachelor furnishings. "I cleared space in the larger bedroom for your things," Seth told her as he brought in the last box. "I've been using the smaller room as storage, but I can clear it out tomorrow for my use." The implication was clear: he intended to honor his promise of separate sleeping arrangements. Zoe felt both relief and an unexpected twinge of something like disappointment, which she quickly dismissed as nerves. "Thank you," she said, suddenly exhausted by the emotional and physical demands of the day. "For everything." Seth's expression was gentle. "You must be tired. Let me show you to your room, and we can sort everything else in the morning." He led her down a short hallway to a comfortable bedroom containing a large bed with a handmade quilt, a dresser, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. A window looked out over what would be the garden in daylight, and a small vase of wildflowers on the dresser suggested Seth had prepared the room with thoughtful attention. "The washroom is just across the hall," he explained. "It's simple, but there's running water. I installed the pipes myself last year." "It's lovely," Zoe said honestly, touched by the evident care he had taken. "Truly." Seth lingered in the doorway, seeming uncertain for the first time since she had met him. "I'll leave you to settle in. If you need anything, I'll be in the front room for a while yet." As he turned to go, Zoe called softly, "Seth." He paused, looking back at her. "I know this isn't a conventional marriage," she said carefully, "but I want you to know that I'm grateful. Not just for the protection of your name, but for your kindness. It's been a long time since I've experienced much of that." Something flickered in Seth's eyes, an emotion Zoe couldn't quite name but which warmed her nonetheless. "Good night, Zoe," he said gently, using her given name for the first time. "Sleep well." After he had gone, Zoe moved slowly around the room, running her fingers over the solid furniture, testing the softness of the quilt, breathing in the faint scent of the wildflowers. This room, this house, represented something she had almost stopped believing in: safety. Not the illusory safety of her marriage to Samuel, which had quickly revealed itself as the most dangerous place in her world, but genuine security built on respect and clear-eyed understanding. Whether this arrangement would evolve beyond its practical beginnings remained to be seen. But as Zoe changed into her nightgown and slipped between the clean sheets of her new bed, she allowed herself to acknowledge a quiet truth. In the brief time she had known Seth Fletcher, he had shown her more genuine consideration than Samuel had in 5 years of marriage. It was, she decided as sleep claimed her, a promising foundation for whatever might come next. Morning brought with it the chance to properly see Seth's homestead in daylight. After dressing in one of her simpler dresses suitable for the domestic work that would undoubtedly fill her day, Zoe made her way to the kitchen, guided by the aroma of coffee and the sound of movement. She paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of Seth at the stove, his back to her as he tended to something in a cast-iron skillet. The domestic tableau was so at odds with her expectations that she couldn't help but smile. "Good morning," she said, stepping into the room. Seth turned, a spatula in hand and surprise briefly crossing his features before his expression warmed. "Good morning. I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Zoe admitted, moving to the stove to peer at his cooking efforts. "You didn't need to prepare breakfast." "Force of habit," Seth replied with a slight shrug. "Living alone, you either learn to cook or go hungry." He gestured to the simple wooden table where 2 places had been set. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." Zoe poured herself a cup, savoring the rich aroma. "I should warn you, I'm a fair hand at most household tasks, but my cooking has received mixed reviews." Seth laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his usually serious face. "Then we'll muddle through together." Though I should warn you, my repertoire is limited to about 5 dishes, all of them simple. As they sat down to a breakfast of fried potatoes and eggs, Zoe was struck by how surprisingly comfortable she felt in this man's home, a man who had been a stranger just days ago, and was now, legally, her husband. There was an ease to Seth's presence that invited trust, so different from Samuel's volatile energy that had kept her perpetually on edge. "I thought we might ride into town this afternoon," Seth suggested as they ate. "People will expect to see us together, and it's better to face the gossip head-on rather than hiding away." Zoe tensed slightly. "Samuel will have heard about our marriage by now," Seth finished. "That's partly why we should go to make it clear that our union is legitimate and public. Sheriff Clayton will be watching for any trouble." Though nervous at the prospect of confronting the town's curiosity and potentially Samuel's rage, Zoe recognized the wisdom in Seth's approach. A secret marriage would only fuel speculation and potentially undermine the legal protection it was intended to provide. "You're right," she agreed. "But first, I should help put this house in proper order. I doubt a bachelor's standards quite match what's needed for a shared home." Seth's expression was amused. "Are you saying my housekeeping is lacking, Mrs. Fletcher?" The teasing use of her new name brought a surprising blush to Zoe's cheeks. "Let's just say there's room for a woman's touch," she replied diplomatically. They spent the morning settling into a tentative domestic rhythm, Zoe organizing her belongings in the bedroom, while Seth cleared space in the spare room for his own use. Together, they rearranged the front room to accommodate some of Zoe's smaller possessions, including her mother's cherished music box and a small collection of books. By early afternoon, the house already felt different, still undeniably Seth's in its masculine solidity, but with touches of feminine presence that softened its harder edges. The change was subtle but significant, like the first hints of spring after a long winter. As they prepared to ride into town, Zoe found herself growing increasingly anxious. Seth, noticing her repeated adjustments to her bonnet and gloves, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We don't have to do this today if you're not ready," he said quietly. Zoe straightened her spine, drawing on the inner strength that had allowed her to survive 5 years with Samuel. "No, you were right the first time. Delaying only makes it harder." Seth nodded, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. "I'll saddle the horses." Riding beside Seth along the road to Copper Creek, Zoe was acutely aware of how their appearance would be interpreted by the townspeople, the foreman from Silverton Ranch and the former Mrs. O'Hara, now conspicuously together as husband and wife mere days after her dramatic departure from her first marriage. The speed of events would only fuel speculation about the nature of their relationship. "People will talk," she said, voicing her concern aloud. "They'll assume the worst, that we were involved before my marriage ended." "Let them talk," Seth replied, his expression serene. "Those who matter know the truth, and those who don't matter will find some new gossip soon enough." His calm acceptance of potential scandal was reassuring. Still, as the buildings of Copper Creek came into view, Zoe felt her pulse quickening with apprehension. This would be her first public appearance as Mrs. Fletcher and potentially her first confrontation with Samuel since her escape. They rode directly to the Mercantile, where Mr. Patterson greeted them with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, emphasizing her new name with obvious approval. "How good to see you looking so well." Other customers in the store turned to stare openly, their curiosity barely concealed behind whispers and sidelong glances. Zoe held her head high, grateful for Seth's solid presence beside her as they gathered the supplies they had come for. "O'Hara's been in a state since hearing the news," Patterson murmured as he tallied their purchases. Raging drunk at the saloon last night, threatening all manner of things. Sheriff had to lock him up again to cool off. Seth's jaw tightened. Is he still in jail? Patterson shook his head. Released this morning. His brother paid his fine and took him to the hotel, from what I heard. As if summoned by their conversation, the mercantile door burst open, and Samuel O'Hara stumbled in, his face flushed with drink despite the early hour. He froze when he spotted Zoe and Seth, his expression contorting with fury. Well, if it isn't the happy couple, he sneered, his words slurring slightly. Mighty convenient how quick you found yourself a new husband, Zoe. Seth stepped slightly in front of Zoe, his posture alert but controlled. O'Hara, you're drunk. Go back to the hotel and sleep it off. Don't tell me what to do, Fletcher, Samuel spat. That's my wife you've stolen. Ex-wife, Seth corrected calmly. The annulment is legal and binding. Samuel lurched forward, jabbing a finger in Seth's direction. Legal trickery. We all know what really happened. You've been sniffing around her for months, waiting for your chance. Zoe moved to stand beside Seth, refusing to cower behind him. That's not true, Samuel, and you know it. Our marriage was over the moment you raised your hand to me the first time. Samuel's face darkened dangerously. You ungrateful— Enough, O'Hara, Mr. Patterson interrupted, emerging from behind the counter with a shotgun held casually but visibly. I won't have this kind of scene in my store. Take your grievances elsewhere. For a tense moment, Samuel seemed poised to escalate further. Then, with a final venomous glare at Zoe and Seth, he spat on the floor and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The mercantile fell silent in his wake, the other customers wide-eyed at the confrontation they had witnessed. Zoe realized she was trembling slightly, the familiar fear response to Samuel's anger hard to suppress even with Seth beside her. Perhaps we should finish our shopping another day, Seth suggested quietly, his hand coming to rest supportively at the small of her back. No, Zoe said firmly, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. We came for supplies and we'll get them. I won't let him chase me away. Pride flickered in Seth's eyes. As you wish, Mrs. Fletcher. They completed their purchases with deliberate calm, though Zoe was acutely aware of the speculative gazes following their every move. By the time they left the mercantile, word of the confrontation had spread, and more than the usual number of townspeople seemed to have business on the main street, all attempting to catch a glimpse of the newly married couple. Perhaps we should pay a visit to the Silverton Ranch office while we're in town, Seth suggested, clearly recognizing Zoe's discomfort under such scrutiny. Robert asked me to discuss some business matters when convenient. Grateful for the excuse to retreat from the public eye, Zoe nodded. That sounds sensible. As they mounted their horses, Zoe caught sight of Samuel watching them from the saloon doorway across the street, his expression dark with resentment. Seth followed her gaze and frowned. He won't give up easily, he observed quietly. No, Zoe agreed. Samuel has never taken well to losing anything he considers his property. She met Seth's concerned gaze steadily. But I'm not his property anymore. I'm my own woman with your name as protection. Seth's expression softened. More than my name, Zoe. You have my word that he'll never hurt you again. As they rode toward the Silverton office, Zoe found herself wondering what she had done to deserve such steadfast support from this quiet, honorable man. Whatever his initial motivations for offering marriage, Seth Fletcher had already proven himself the kind of ally she had never thought to find in this harsh territory. The real question now was how their unusual arrangement would evolve as they settled into life together, and whether Samuel's wounded pride would allow them the peace to discover the answer. The weeks that followed established a tentative rhythm to their shared life. Seth continued his work as foreman at the Silverton Ranch, leaving at dawn and returning in the late afternoon. Zoe took over the management of the homestead, discovering unexpected satisfaction in caring for a home where her efforts were appreciated rather than criticized. Their evenings developed a comfortable pattern: shared meals where they discussed their respective days, followed by quiet hours before the fire. Seth often read from one of his many books, while Zoe worked on mending or embroidery, the silence between them companionable rather than strained. They were careful to maintain separate bedrooms, their relationship developing as a friendship built on mutual respect, rather than the passionate romance that outsiders likely assumed. Yet Zoe sometimes caught Seth watching her with an expression that suggested he might welcome a deeper connection, though he never pressed the issue. For her part, Zoe found herself noticing things about her new husband that stirred unexpected feelings: the quiet strength in his hands as he worked around the homestead, the thoughtful way he listened when she spoke, the gentle humor that emerged more frequently as she came to know him better. Samuel remained a troubling presence on the periphery of their lives. Though he had made no direct approach since their confrontation at the mercantile, reports reached them of his continued drinking and threats. His brother had returned to Tucson, but not before purchasing a small property on the outskirts of Copper Creek, suggesting Samuel intended to remain in the area. "He's waiting for something," Seth observed one evening as they discussed the latest news from town. "Watching for an opportunity." Zoe shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "What can he possibly hope to accomplish? The annulment is legal. Our marriage is recognized." "Men like O'Hara don't think in terms of legalities," Seth replied grimly. "He sees you as something taken from him, and his pride won't let that stand." The concern in Seth's eyes touched Zoe deeply. Over the past weeks, she had come to trust this man in a way she had never trusted Samuel, even in the earliest days of their courtship. Seth's protectiveness never felt controlling; rather, it stemmed from genuine care for her well-being. "I won't live in fear of him," she said firmly. "We've built something good here, Seth. I won't let Samuel's bitterness poison it." Seth's expression softened. "No, we won't let him." After a moment's hesitation, he added, "I've been meaning to ask. Are you happy here, Zoe, with this arrangement?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Zoe considered her answer carefully. "I am," she said truthfully. "Happier than I expected to be. When I agreed to this marriage, I was desperate for escape, willing to accept almost any alternative to returning to Samuel." She met his gaze directly. "But what I've found here with you is more than merely an escape. It's a home, a partnership I never thought to have." Something flickered in Seth's eyes: hope, perhaps, or a deeper emotion he wasn't ready to name. "I'm glad," he said simply. "That's what I wanted for you." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then Seth cleared his throat and rose from his chair. "It's getting late. I should check the barn before turning in." After he had gone, Zoe remained by the fire, reflecting on the curious path that had brought her to this point. In just over a month, she had gone from a life of fear and subjugation to one of respect and emerging joy. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement was gradually transforming into something neither of them had anticipated. The question was whether they would have the courage to acknowledge that transformation, and what would happen when they did. 2 days later, Zoe rode into town alone to collect mail and purchase supplies, while Seth attended to a cattle matter at the far end of the Silverton property. Though initially hesitant about venturing to Copper Creek unaccompanied, she had gradually reclaimed her independence over the weeks, refusing to let Samuel's lingering presence restrict her movements. The trip proceeded uneventfully, until she emerged from the post office to find Samuel waiting beside her horse, his appearance more composed than during their last encounter, but his eyes holding the cold calculation she had come to dread during their marriage. "Mrs. Fletcher," he greeted, the new name twisted into a mockery on his lips. "Out alone today? How trusting your new husband must be." Zoe maintained a calm exterior despite her racing heart. "What do you want, Samuel?" "Just a civil conversation with my former wife," he replied with artificial pleasantness. "Is that so much to ask? We have nothing to discuss," Zoe said firmly, moving toward her horse. "Please step aside." Samuel made no move to let her pass. "I've been thinking about our situation, Zoe. This charade with Fletcher has gone on long enough, don't you think? It's time to be reasonable." "There's no charade," Zoe replied evenly. "Seth is my husband now, legally and in truth." A knowing smirk crossed Samuel's face. "In truth? Are you sharing his bed, then?" "Giving him what a husband is entitled to." The crude insinuation brought color to Zoe's cheeks, but she refused to be baited. "My relationship with Seth is none of your concern." "I thought as much," Samuel said, his smirk widening. "He's too honorable to take advantage, isn't he? Playing the gentleman while keeping you in a marriage of convenience." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I wonder what the good people of Copper Creek would think if they knew your marriage was unconsummated, might cast doubt on its legitimacy." Alarm flickered through Zoe. Though she wasn't certain of the legal implications, she knew that unconsummated marriages could sometimes be challenged. The fact that Samuel had seized upon this vulnerability suggested he had been consulting legal counsel. "Move away from my horse," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm leaving now." Samuel stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy. "Think about what I've said, Zoe. This farce can't continue indefinitely. Sooner or later, you'll have to face reality." As Zoe mounted and rode away, she could feel Samuel's eyes following her, his words echoing uncomfortably in her mind. The encounter left her shaken not only by his veiled threats, but by the kernel of truth in his taunts. Her marriage to Seth, for all its growing emotional intimacy, remained incomplete in the physical sense, a fact that apparently had not escaped Samuel's notice or calculation. When Seth returned home that evening, Zoe debated whether to mention the encounter. Part of her wanted to spare him additional concern, but her experience with Samuel had taught her the danger of concealing potentially significant information. "I saw Samuel in town today," she said as they cleared the dinner dishes. "He was different, calculating rather than angry." Seth's expression immediately sharpened. "Did he threaten you?" "Not directly," Zoe replied, focusing on drying a plate rather than meeting Seth's concerned gaze. "But he implied that our marriage might be vulnerable to challenge because—" She hesitated, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Because it hasn't been consummated," Seth finished quietly. Zoe looked up, startled. "How did you know?" "It's the most obvious legal vulnerability," Seth explained, his tone carefully neutral. "I've been concerned about it myself, though I didn't want to pressure you by mentioning it." The practical discussion of such an intimate matter should have been embarrassing. Yet Zoe found herself appreciating Seth's straightforward approach. There was no hint of the entitlement Samuel had always displayed regarding physical relations, only genuine concern for their legal security and her comfort. "You think there's any merit to his threat?" she asked. Seth considered the question thoughtfully. "Possibly. Unconsummated marriages can sometimes be annulled, though it would be difficult to prove without your cooperation." He hesitated, then added, "But the fact that he's raising the issue suggests he's exploring legal options." Zoe nodded, setting aside the dried plate and reaching for another. "What should we do?" The question hung between them, its implications extending far beyond legal strategy into the fundamental nature of their relationship. Seth leaned against the counter, his expression serious. "That depends on what you want, Zoe," he said finally. "When we entered this marriage, I promised it would remain as limited or as genuine as we both wished it to be. That promise still stands." Zoe studied the man before her, the man who had rescued her from despair, offered his name for her protection, and treated her with unfailing respect for weeks without asking anything in return. In the weeks of their shared life, her initial gratitude had evolved into something deeper, something that increasingly resembled love. "I think," she said carefully, "that perhaps it's time our marriage became genuine in all respects." Seth's expression remained controlled, but something flickered in his eyes, hope tempered by caution. "Are you suggesting this only because of O'Hara's threat?" "No," Zoe replied honestly. "I'm suggesting it because I've come to care for you, Seth. Because what began as an arrangement of necessity has become something I value deeply." She met his gaze directly. "Because I find myself wanting more than friendship from the man I call husband." Seth moved closer, slowly enough that she could have stepped away had she wished. When she remained in place, he gently took her hands in his. "I need you to be certain," he said, his voice low and intense. "After what you endured with O'Hara, I won't accept anything less than your complete comfort and desire." "I am certain," Zoe said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I trust you, Seth. Completely." Something in Seth's expression shifted, the careful restraint he had maintained for weeks giving way to a warmth that took Zoe's breath away. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to reconsider, he leaned down and kissed her. Unlike the brief, ceremonial kiss they had shared at their wedding, this was a true expression of emerging feelings, gentle at first, then deepening as Zoe responded with unexpected eagerness. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Seth rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," he confessed softly. "Why didn't you?" Zoe asked, her hands still resting against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. "Because you needed time," Seth replied simply. "Time to heal, to trust again. I would have waited as long as necessary." The tenderness in his words moved Zoe deeply. This was what had been missing in her marriage to Samuel, not just the absence of cruelty, but the presence of genuine care for her needs and feelings. "I don't want to wait any longer," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "I want a true marriage with you, Seth. In every sense." Later that night, as moonlight filtered through the bedroom curtains, Zoe discovered what it meant to be truly cherished by a man who valued her pleasure as much as his own. Seth's touch was reverent, his patience infinite as he guided her through an experience so different from what she had known before that it seemed like an entirely new act. In the aftermath, as they lay tangled together in the sheets of what was now truly their shared bed, Zoe felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The ghost of Samuel's cruel hand seemed finally exorcised, replaced by the memory of Seth's gentle touch and whispered words of affection. "Are you all right?" Seth murmured against her hair, his arm a comforting weight across her waist. "More than all right," Zoe replied, nestling closer against him. "I feel whole again, as if a broken part of me has finally healed." Seth's arms tightened around her. "I've been falling in love with you since that first night at your window," he admitted quietly. "When I saw your tears and knew I couldn't stand by any longer." The confession sent warmth blooming through Zoe's chest. "And I've been falling in love with you since you said those tears would end," she whispered back. "I just didn't recognize it until recently." They fell asleep entwined, their breathing synchronizing in the quiet darkness. Whatever legal challenge Samuel might attempt, Their marriage was now complete in every sense, a union founded initially on necessity, but transformed by genuine love into something neither had expected to find. The following weeks brought a deepening of their relationship, as they settled into life as true husband and wife. The physical intimacy they now shared seemed to unlock a new level of emotional closeness as well, with conversations flowing more easily and laughter becoming a regular feature of their home. Samuel remained a shadow at the edges of their happiness, his presence in town a constant reminder of potential trouble. Reports reached them that he had hired a lawyer from Prescott, though the exact nature of his legal strategy remained unclear. "Whatever he's planning, we're prepared," Seth assured Zoe as they rode home from church one Sunday. "Our marriage is legitimate in every sense now. Even if he attempts to challenge the annulment, we have strong legal standing." Zoe nodded, though a lingering unease persisted. She had learned through bitter experience that Samuel was most dangerous when calculating rather than impulsive. Their concerns were temporarily set aside the following week, when Emily Silverton invited them to a gathering at the ranch to celebrate the arrival of her sister from San Francisco. The event would be the first social occasion they would attend together as a couple, and Zoe found herself looking forward to it with unexpected eagerness. "It feels strange to be anticipating a social event," she admitted to Seth as they prepared for the gathering. With Samuel, such occasions were always fraught with tension. "I never knew what might trigger his temper." Seth paused in the act of buttoning his best shirt to meet her gaze in the mirror. "You don't need to worry about that with me," he said simply. "I'm proud to have you beside me, Zoe, always." The evening at the Silvertons proved to be more enjoyable than Zoe had dared hope. Though she initially felt self-conscious under the curious gazes of those who knew her story, the obvious happiness between her and Seth soon quieted most speculation. Even those who might have been inclined to judge seemed disarmed by the genuine affection evident in their interactions. "You two make quite the handsome couple," Emily observed warmly as they shared a quiet moment on the veranda. "I must admit, when Seth first proposed this arrangement, I had my doubts, but seeing you together now—" She smiled knowingly. "Some marriages of convenience become the greatest love stories, it seems." Zoe blushed but didn't contradict her. "Seth has given me more than I ever thought possible," she said simply. "A fresh start, safety, partnership." "And love?" Emily asked gently. "Yes," Zoe admitted, her gaze finding Seth across the room, deep in conversation with Robert. As if sensing her attention, he looked up and smiled in a way that still made her heart beat faster. "Love most of all." The evening ended on a high note, with Zoe and Seth riding home beneath a canopy of stars, their horses walking close enough that their legs occasionally brushed. The contact, casual as it was, sent a pleasant warmth through Zoe, a reminder of how far they had come from the cautious strangers who had exchanged vows of convenience months earlier. "I've been thinking," Seth said as they approached their homestead, the outline of the house visible in the moonlight, "about the future, our future." "What about it?" Zoe asked, curious at his thoughtful tone. Seth guided his horse slightly closer to hers. "When we married, it was with the understanding that you might eventually want your independence, that our arrangement could be temporary." He paused, then continued carefully, "I want you to know that I hope it isn't. Temporary, I mean." Zoe reined her horse to a stop, prompting Seth to do the same. In the silvery moonlight, she could see the vulnerability in his expression, the fear that perhaps she still viewed their marriage as a practical solution rather than a permanent bond. "Seth Fletcher," she said softly, "do you honestly believe I would want to leave what we've built together? This home, this life?" She shook her head, smiling gently. This marriage may have begun as an arrangement, but it's become the greatest blessing of my life." The relief in Seth's eyes was palpable. "I just needed to be certain," he said, "that you're here because you want to be, not because you feel you have no other choice." "I'm exactly where I want to be," Zoe assured him, reaching across to take his hand, "with exactly who I want to be with." They completed the journey home in companionable silence, both aware that a significant threshold had been crossed. What had begun as a temporary solution to an immediate problem had been acknowledged by both as the permanent foundation of their shared future. The peace of that night extended into the following days as they settled more deeply into their life together. Seth continued his work at the Silverton Ranch while Zoe maintained their homestead and began tentatively planning improvements to the garden for the coming spring. The specter of Samuel's potential legal challenge remained, but it seemed increasingly remote as their marriage strengthened. Then, one evening as they sat together before the fire, a sharp knock at the door shattered their contentment. Seth rose to answer it, his hand instinctively checking the position of the rifle mounted nearby, a precaution he had maintained since bringing Zoe to the homestead. Sheriff Clayton stood on the porch, his expression grave in the lamplight. "Fletcher," he greeted, nodding to Zoe as she appeared behind her husband. "Mrs. Fletcher, sorry to disturb you at this hour." "What is it, Sheriff?" Seth asked, ushering the man inside. Clayton removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "It's O'Hara. He's filed a formal petition challenging the annulment of his marriage to Mrs. Fletcher. Claims there was no fraud involved, that she was fully aware of his previous marriage before they wed." Zoe gasped. "That's a lie. I knew nothing about a wife in Texas until Reverend Thomas discovered the records." "I believe you, madam," Clayton assured her. "But O'Hara has produced a witness, his brother, who claims to have been present when he supposedly told you about his first marriage during your courtship." Seth's expression darkened. "Perjury, then. His brother wasn't even in Arizona during our courtship." "Can you prove that?" Clayton asked. Zoe and Seth exchanged troubled glances. Samuel's brother had been in Tucson for years, but proving he hadn't visited Copper Creek during Zoe and Samuel's courtship 5 years earlier would be difficult. "What does this mean for us?" Zoe asked quietly. Clayton sighed. "Judge Parker has agreed to hear the petition next week. If he rules in O'Hara's favor, the annulment could be invalidated, which would technically render your current marriage." He hesitated. "Bigamous," Seth finished grimly, "which would mean our marriage is void and Zoe is still legally O'Hara's wife." The implications were staggering. Everything they had built together could be undone by a judge's ruling based on false testimony. "There must be something we can do," Zoe said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Some way to prove Samuel is lying." "Your best chance is to find evidence that contradicts the brother's testimony," Clayton advised. "Or witnesses who can attest that you genuinely didn't know about the first marriage." After the sheriff departed with promises to keep them informed of any developments, Seth and Zoe sat at their kitchen table, the happiness of earlier hours replaced by grim determination. "He won't win this," Seth said firmly. "We'll fight him with every legal means available." Zoe reached for his hand, drawing strength from his certainty. "I believe you, but Samuel has his brother's testimony and money for legal representation." "What do we have?" "The truth," Seth replied simply, "and people who know your character. People who know that you would never have entered a marriage with a man you knew had deceived you about something so significant." As they discussed potential strategies late into the night, Zoe was struck by the contrast between this crisis and the troubles of her first marriage. With Samuel, she had faced each problem alone, her husband more often the source of her distress than her ally in addressing it. With Seth, Even this grave threat felt somehow manageable because they confronted it together. The following days were a blur of activity as they gathered evidence and witnesses to support their case. Mr. Patterson confirmed that Zoe had been genuinely shocked when Reverend Thomas revealed Samuel's previous marriage. Dr. Wilson testified that Samuel had once confided, while drunk and receiving treatment for a minor injury, that what the woman doesn't know won't hurt her regarding his past. Most significantly, Emily Silverton recalled a conversation with Samuel's brother during his recent visit, in which he had mentioned never having visited Copper Creek before, directly contradicting his claim to have been present during Zoe and Samuel's courtship. By the time the hearing arrived, they had assembled a compelling case against Samuel's petition. Still, as Zoe dressed that morning in her finest dress, the blue one she had worn to marry Seth, anxiety gnawed at her. Judge Parker was known to favor husbands' rights in marital disputes. Would he be swayed by evidence, or would his prejudices prevail? "Whatever happens today," Seth said quietly as he helped her into the wagon, "remember that what we've found together is real. No court ruling can change that." Zoe squeezed his hand, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "I know. But I can't bear the thought of being forced back into Samuel's control, even legally." "That won't happen," Seth promised, his voice hard with determination. "Even if the worst occurs and the annulment is invalidated, we'll find another solution. I won't lose you to him, Zoe." The courthouse was crowded when they arrived. The people of Copper Creek, unable to resist the drama of such unusual proceedings. Zoe held her head high as they moved through the gathered onlookers, conscious of the sympathetic glances from those who supported them and the judgmental stares of those who didn't. Samuel was already seated at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer and brother, his expression smug as he watched them enter. The sight of him still caused Zoe's heart to race with old fear, but the feeling was tempered now by Seth's solid presence beside her, and the knowledge of her own hard-won strength. Judge Parker called the court to order with obvious reluctance, making it clear that he considered such disputes distasteful and better resolved privately. Nevertheless, the proceedings began, with Samuel's lawyer presenting their case first. The allegations were as expected: that Zoe had known about Samuel's previous marriage before they wed, that the annulment had been obtained fraudulently, and that her hasty remarriage to Seth suggested impropriety predating the annulment. Samuel and his brother both testified smoothly, their stories perfectly aligned in a way that suggested careful rehearsal. When it was their turn, Robert Silverton, acting as their legal representative, systematically dismantled the brothers' testimony with the evidence they had gathered. The contradiction in the brothers' statements about never having visited Copper Creek before proved particularly damaging, casting doubt on the veracity of his entire account. Finally, Zoe herself was called to testify. Rising on legs that felt unsteady, she moved to the witness chair, acutely aware of Samuel's cold gaze following her movement. "Mrs. Fletcher," Judge Parker addressed her, his use of her current name a small mercy, "did you have knowledge of Mr. O'Hara's previous marriage before you wed him 5 years ago?" "No, Your Honor," Zoe replied clearly. "I learned of it only when Reverend Thomas discovered the records during the annulment proceedings." "And would this information have affected your decision to marry Mr. O'Hara had you known it?" Zoe considered the question carefully. "Yes, Your Honor. Not because I would have objected to him being a widower, but because his deliberate concealment of such significant information would have demonstrated a dishonesty I couldn't have accepted in a husband." Samuel's lawyer rose for cross-examination, his approach aggressive from the outset. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, the pause before her name deliberately pointed. "You claim you would have rejected Mr. O'Hara had you known of his previous marriage. Yet you yourself have now remarried with remarkable haste. Some might call that hypocritical." Zoe felt heat rise to her cheeks, but maintained her composure. "The circumstances were entirely different, sir. My marriage to Mr. Fletcher came after a legal annulment and was entered into with complete honesty on both sides." "Complete honesty," the lawyer repeated skeptically. "Then perhaps you can explain to the court why you fled your husband's home in the company of Mr. Fletcher, a man you claim to have barely known at the time." "Objection," Robert Silverton interjected. "Mrs. Fletcher's reasons for leaving her first marriage are well documented and include physical abuse, which has no bearing on the question of whether she knew about O'Hara's previous marriage." "Sustained," Judge Parker ruled, though he looked displeased. "Confine your questions to the matter at hand, counselor." The questioning continued, increasingly hostile as Samuel's lawyer attempted to portray Zoe as calculating and dishonest. Through it all, she maintained her dignity, answering truthfully even when the questions became painfully personal. Finally, when both sides had presented their cases, Judge Parker announced he would consider the evidence and deliver his ruling the following day. The delay was both a relief and a torment, another night of uncertainty, but also a sign that the judge was taking the matter seriously, rather than simply ruling in Samuel's favor as they had feared. As they left the courthouse, Samuel intercepted them on the steps, his brother flanking him like a bodyguard. "Enjoy your last night as Mrs. Fletcher," he said quietly, his voice carrying only to Zoe and Seth. "Tomorrow you'll be coming home where you belong." Before Seth could respond, Emily Silverton appeared at Zoe's side, linking arms with her in a show of support. "I believe you're mistaken, Mr. O'Hara," she said pleasantly but firmly. "Zoe is already home where she belongs." The public display of solidarity from one of the territory's most respected women was not lost on the onlookers. Samuel's face tightened with anger, but surrounded by witnesses, he could only tip his hat with false civility and withdraw. That night, Zoe and Seth held each other close, neither sleeping much as they contemplated the uncertainty of their future. "I won't go back to him," Zoe whispered into the darkness. "Even if the judge rules against us, I'd rather leave the territory entirely." "It won't come to that," Seth assured her, though his voice betrayed his own worry. "The evidence is on our side, Zoe. Truth has to count for something, even in Judge Parker's court." When morning came, they prepared for the ruling with solemn determination. The courthouse was even more crowded than the previous day, the entire town seemingly in attendance to witness the outcome of this unusual case. Judge Parker entered the courtroom, his expression inscrutable as he took his place behind the bench. After calling for order, he cleared his throat and addressed the assembled crowd. "Having considered the evidence presented by both parties, I am prepared to render my decision in the matter of O'Hara versus Fletcher," he announced. "This case hinges on whether Mrs. Zoe O'Hara, now Fletcher, had prior knowledge of Mr. Samuel O'Hara's previous marriage before their wedding 5 years ago." He paused, shuffling the papers before him. "The testimony presented shows clear contradictions. Mr. O'Hara and his brother claim Mrs. Fletcher was informed, while she and several respectable witnesses maintained she was not." The judge frowned. "Particularly troubling is the inconsistency in Mr. James O'Hara's statements regarding his previous visits to Copper Creek, which casts significant doubt on his credibility as a witness." Zoe felt Seth's hand tighten around hers as they waited for the judge's conclusion. "In matters of marital dispute, this court generally defers to the husband's authority," Parker continued, causing Zoe's heart to sink. However, the evidence of deliberate deception on Mr. O'Hara's part is substantial and compelling. He straightened in his chair, his decision apparently reached. I therefore find that the annulment was properly granted on the grounds of fraud as Mrs. Fletcher did not have knowledge of Mr. O'Hara's previous marriage. The petition to invalidate the annulment is denied, and Mrs. Fletcher's subsequent marriage to Mr. Seth Fletcher remains valid and legally binding. A collective murmur swept through the courtroom. Zoe sat in stunned silence, the judge's words taking a moment to fully register. Seth's arm came around her shoulders, his embrace conveying both relief and triumph. Across the aisle, Samuel's face contorted with rage. He surged to his feet, shoving aside his lawyer's restraining hand. "This is a travesty," he shouted. "She was my wife." "Sit down, Mr. O'Hara," Judge Parker ordered sternly. "The court has ruled. Further disruption will result in contempt charges." For a terrible moment, Zoe thought Samuel might physically lunge toward them. But his brother grabbed his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. After a tense standoff, Samuel subsided, his glare promising that this was not the end. Outside the courthouse, friends and supporters surrounded Zoe and Seth with congratulations and well wishes. Emily hugged Zoe tightly, whispering, "Justice prevails, sometimes even in Arizona territory." As the crowd dispersed and they prepared to return home, Sheriff Clayton approached, his expression troubled despite the favorable ruling. "A word of caution," he said quietly. "O'Hara didn't take that well. Might be wise to keep your guard up for a while, Fletcher." Seth nodded grimly. "We'll be careful, Sheriff. Thank you." The ride home was quiet, both of them processing the events of the day and the weight that had been lifted from their shoulders. The legal cloud that had hung over their marriage had dissipated, leaving their future clear and certain. "It's over," Zoe said as they approached their homestead, the simple structure never looking more welcoming. "Truly over now." Seth helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "Not over," he corrected gently, "just beginning, without shadows from the past." That night, as they celebrated their victory with a special dinner, and the bottle of wine the Silvertons had sent home with them, Zoe reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this place of happiness. From the depths of despair in a marriage where her tears had been met with laughter, she had found her way to a love where her joy was her husband's greatest priority. "What are you thinking about?" Seth asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About that night you came to my window," Zoe replied, "when you said my tears would end." She reached across the table to take his hand. "I didn't believe you then. I couldn't imagine a life without fear and sadness." Seth's fingers interlaced with hers. "And now?" "Now I can't imagine returning to that life," she said simply. "You've shown me what love truly means, Seth. Not possession or control, but partnership and respect." The tenderness in Seth's eyes made her heart swell. "I promised you that night that your tears would end," he said softly. "It's a promise I intend to keep for the rest of our lives together." Later, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Zoe nestled against Seth's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, the soft patter on the roof creating a cocoon of comfort around them. "What do you think Samuel will do now?" she asked, the question that had lingered at the edges of her mind finally finding voice. Seth's arms tightened around her. "His brother will likely take him back to Tucson. There's nothing left for him here except bitterness and failed schemes." "I hope you're right," Zoe murmured. "Even if he stays," Seth said firmly, "he can't touch what we have, Zoe, not anymore." And in that moment, secure in her husband's embrace, Zoe believed him completely. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, equal partners in a love that had been born of necessity, but had blossomed into something far more precious. The months that followed brought the changes of seasons and a deepening of the bond between Zoe and Seth. Spring saw them expanding the garden together, Zoe's vision for flowers among the vegetables bringing color and beauty to the homestead. Summer brought long evenings on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness as they discussed their hopes for the future. Samuel, as Seth had predicted, eventually left Copper Creek, returning to Tucson with his brother after one final confrontation at the saloon that ended with him being escorted out of town by Sheriff Clayton, with a stern warning not to return. As autumn approached again, marking nearly a year since that fateful night when Seth had come to Zoe's window, they received an invitation to the Silverton's Harvest Celebration, the same annual event, where, in previous years, Samuel had often humiliated Zoe with his drunken behavior and cruel comments. "We don't have to attend if it brings back difficult memories," Seth offered as Zoe read the invitation. Noting her momentary hesitation, Zoe shook her head, a gentle smile forming. "No, I want to go. It's time to create new memories to replace the painful ones." She placed a hand over her slightly rounded abdomen, the early signs of pregnancy just becoming visible. "Besides, I think Emily has already guessed our news. She's been watching me rather knowingly at church these past few weeks." Seth's expression softened as he covered her hand with his own, the wonder of impending fatherhood still fresh even weeks after they had confirmed Zoe's pregnancy. "Then we'll go and celebrate properly both the harvest and our own blessed future." The night of the celebration was clear and cool, the Silverton Ranch transformed with lanterns and autumn decorations. As Seth helped Zoe from their wagon, she paused to take in the scene, the warm light spilling from the windows, the sound of music and laughter within, the stars brilliant overhead in the vast Arizona sky. "Happy?" Seth asked, noting her contemplative expression. Zoe turned to him, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied truthfully. "A year ago I couldn't imagine joy like this existed." Seth drew her close, his kiss gentle yet filled with promise. "Your tears ended that night," he murmured against her lips, "but our happiness is just beginning." Hand in hand, they walked toward the welcoming light of the ranch house, their steps aligned and their hearts beating in perfect harmony. Behind them lay the shadows of the past. Before them stretched a future bright with love and possibility, a future they would build together, one day at a time, in the home and life they had claimed as their own.